Hello, welcome to another edition of Studio 5. I'm Scott Howe. The leading cause of death among U.S. military members in peacetime is motor vehicle accidents. Any number of factors contribute to the reasons for that, like age and marital status. Most are single male and have only high school educations. The Armed Forces Health Surveillance Center says youth brings with it inexperience and the increased likelihood that drivers will engage in risky behavior, like driving while drunk or not wearing seatbelts. A report issued by the Surveillance Center says 3,056 service members died in auto accidents between 1999 and 2010. During that same period, 965 were killed on motorcycles. Youth and inexperience are obviously factors that push those numbers up, but what makes so many service members susceptible? Psychiatrists are attributing at least some of those accidents to post-traumatic stress. So-called risky behavior was recently added to the list of symptoms for PTSD. The Pentagon Channel's Petty Officer Lori Bent has more.
It's pretty common knowledge that combat and other high-intensity experiences can cause post-traumatic stress. And we know that symptoms include alcohol or drug abuse, difficulty sleeping, and feeling uncomfortable in crowds or around loud noises. But what about this? Not all motorcycle driving is considered risky behavior, but taking risks on bikes, in automobiles, and other places may be a symptom of a bigger problem.
Those who've been through intense emotional experiences like combat is that they'll begin to engage in risky behaviors. And this can be everything from using substances, alcohol and drugs, to driving cars very fast or riding motorcycles fast.
There are various possible reasons for that. A driver may be looking to duplicate the adrenaline rush of combat, or may have survived situations others did not and feels invulnerable. Some risky behaviors are actually taught overseas.
The behaviors that they learned while in theater that kept them alive may not function the same way when they come back home. That is, the same behavior may put them at greater risk here.
Things like changing lanes under a bridge to avoid attacks from above might have worked well in Afghanistan, but in any domestic urban setting is very dangerous. A seatbelt may delay an emergency exit from a Humvee, but offers more protection than peril here in the States.
We shouldn't assume that it all has to do with a psychiatric illness. Not everybody who comes back from war and goes out and drives really fast has PTSD. They may just drive really fast. So it's not, just because somebody's out there taking risks or doing adventure sports or something like that, don't assume that they must have PTSD.
With us today to talk about driving safety, we have Col Doug Slocum. He is the Director of Safety for the Air National Guard. And I'm joined by TPC's Petty Officer Kevin O'Brien and our social media producer Terry Turner. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. Well, Colonel, they call it risky behavior. Now, I think to your average everyday person, a layman, combat would be considered pretty risky behavior.
Definitely.
So why then is driving such an obstacle after someone returns from having been in a war zone?
Well, living in a high-risk environment like that for a long period of time, people get used to taking certain risks or operating in a certain way. Now they come back stateside and they're operating in what they consider a zero-risk environment. So they think they basically have the ability to push it up, that they can take more risks and there's not anybody there that's necessarily going to pose that threat to them or that risk. And sometimes they can think that they're bulletproof. If I can survive there, I can do anything I want here. So yes, there is a tendency, and we've had studies that have shown, especially for the ground troops, that when they first come back from a deployment, and especially once again the younger troops, they have a tendency to engage in those risky behaviors, the speeding, the drinking, the being distracted while driving, being fatigued. They think they can just power through and deal with all these, and statistics show that they simply can't.
I would think that if you're going to go into the military, you'd be somewhat prone toward risky behavior to begin with if you're willing to lay your life on the line in combat. Is there something that shows that there is more risky behavior among service members when it comes to highway safety?
Well, certainly we want people in combat zones to be, I hate to almost say that we want them to engage in risky behavior, but you're exactly right. So what we need to do is train them that there's a time and a place that you act that way, but then there's a time and a place that you need to turn that key off, and that's not the way that you operate on our streets. So it's simply something that we have to condition into all the folks in the military.
Now, sir, on the flip side, in my experiences in the Navy, we'd spend 7 months out at sea, and we wouldn't be in a vehicle. And when you return back from deployment, I remember numerous safety briefings from our safety officer. When we return back, we haven't been in a car for 7, 8, sometimes 9 months, and all of a sudden we're thrust back into driving a vehicle again. Is there any sort of messaging that you put out for those types of service members that return from a deployment?
And that situation is more for the Air Force and the Navy, but you're exactly right. That would be a proficiency issue because now they just haven't done it for a while. They've been in a different environment. They haven't been operating on the streets, and now you're simply going back to operating there again. Statistics show that in the Air Force and the Navy, that coming off the deployments, off of the overseas, lower statistics than in the Army and the Marine Corps in that particular case. But once again, it's a little bit different. It's more of a proficiency issue than a high-risk type of scenario.
Is it also maybe a case of you coming back to the States and suddenly, okay, there are stop signs or yield signs or traffic lights at every intersection? Certainly we know that in some of these countries where we've been at war, that's not the case. You have traffic cops, you have somewhat orderly behavior to traffic. Does that give people a false impression of safety?
I'm not wouldn't think that, because there's a lot in the military we're taught to follow rules, and I think for the most part people are really good about that. It's just a different set of rules that they operate on. But you tell folks the rules, and for the most part we're very compliant with that. We stop at stop signs even though there's no one around, that sort of thing in the military as part of the training. But once again, it's a different set of rules, and it goes back to the proficiency a little bit. We have to switch our mindset to be able to focus on where we are and what we're doing.
Right. Kevin was talking about the messaging that you might have coming off a deployment like this, or how that might be different coming off a deployment from a ship. Here in the United States, lots of different agencies have spent many decades now trying to get people to change their driving habits, and one of the most important ones was getting people to wear seat belts. And of course, we all remember Vince and Larry.
After this joyride, I'm out of the crash dummy business for good.
But Vince, it's a great job. Heck, they'd have to pry me away from it.
Anybody home? Larry, they do pry you away from it.
Oh, yeah.
For years I've been eating steering wheels. For what?
To prove how safety belts save lives.
But thousands die every year in car accidents because they don't buckle up.
Vince, we're dummies. We don't wear safety belts.
Larry, you really know how to hurt a guy. Hit it! Yeah!
So, timeless messages. Always funny. They could put those back on the air today, and I think they would be very effective.
And it's a timely safety message even today. One of the most effective tools that we have in automobiles to this day is the seatbelt. And it's back to basics. Put that seatbelt on is the most effective single thing you can do driving. That piece of equipment, operating that piece of equipment that's going to affect not necessarily getting in an accident, but whether you get injured or killed in an accident.
Doesn't it also help the other people on the road if you're wearing your seatbelt, because it was originally designed to keep you behind the wheel of your own car so that you had control over it?
There is a degree of that in terms of being able to keep you, in control of an operating vehicle under certain circumstances, a quick lane change or having to maneuver. But I think that, like I said, the biggest advent of safety for that safety belt itself is keeping you in that vehicle and not being ejected in a crash, because that's where people get killed most often.
Aren't there some statistics now, though, that say that seatbelt use is actually down from what it has been in previous years from its high?
Well, from what I've seen on most statistics, it's actually plateaued is the term that I would use. In other words, that we've increased our use of seatbelts and we're sitting somewhere in the mid to high 90s for the most part, for at least the military population, in the high 90%. And then it's kind of just plateaued at that. We would like it to be 100%. Every time you get in, it should be habitual. You sit behind the wheel, click. Right. And you put that thing on, because like I said, it's the simplest thing you can do and the most effective thing that you can do when it comes to vehicle safety.
All right, well, we've got a lot more to talk about coming up after the break. Even avid motorcycle riders say you're bound to go down sometime. Staying safe on a bike when we come back. Welcome back to Studio 5. I'm Scott Howe. Petty Officer Kevin O'Brien and our social media director Terry Turner are here with me. And our guest is Colonel Doug Slocum. He is the Air National Guard's safety director, and we are talking about driving safety, specifically now motorcycle driving. Roughly a fourth of motor vehicle deaths among active duty military are due to motorcycle accidents. This graph shows the number of motorcycle deaths that occurred between 1999 and 2010. Note the large increase between the years 2001 and 2002. The numbers go up almost every year, peaking in 2008, when 113 service members were killed on motorcycles. The drop in 2009 to 82 is attributed to the services launching safety campaigns and training. In an effort to keep those numbers trending downward, motorcycle training courses are offered weekly at many bases, and we spent some time learning the basics at Quantico Marine Base in Virginia.
It's an American passion. It's been since the conception of a motorcycle. People just love them.
It's also a military passion.
Oh, I love the ride. It's very relaxing.
There's required riding for all military personnel who use bikes. Basic courses are geared for true beginners.
Yeah, that was my very first time. How'd it feel? It felt good. Yeah, exciting.
But they also benefit those forced to put the wheels away for a bit.
Facing that way, correct. Got it? Okay, go ahead and fire them up.
I've been overseas for the past 3 years and I didn't ride a motorcycle over there. It was in storage. So coming back, it was just comfortable for me coming back to, go back through the foundations and, the fundamental skills than to get right back on riding my bike again.
So part 2 was power walking to the other side of the range. Remember that?
It starts off from the basics, really just learning what the clutch, friction zone, braking, and just getting it to move. And by the end, they're basic riders. They have the basic fundamentals.
I think that the class definitely builds confidence in what I'm doing, and it helps me to know what I can handle.
For these riders, it's not about speed or danger. It's almost the opposite.
It gives me a peace of mind, especially after, a hard day at work, an easy day at work, just the unwind time, and also just getting the air.
One of the reasons I came out to learn how to ride is to try to reconnect with my dad a little bit, and also it's a sense of freedom to get out there on an open road and put it in the wind, because I have the ambition to go out and ride in the country, and that's one of the reasons I just go out and take in America.
It's no coincidence that we shot that piece at Quantico, and that's because the average statistics about a motor vehicle death occurrence is that they are a Marine, that they are a young black man between the age of 20 and 24, and having just returned from a deployment.
Yes, definitely in motorcycle safety in this day and age, more people are riding motorcycles, and over time, certainly motorcycles have gotten more powerful, speedier. The sport, super sport, hyper sport categories of motorcycles, it's a big problem we have right now, and it kind of goes back to that risky behavior a little bit. People like the freedom, but we have to realize that it exposes you to a hazard in riding a motorcycle.
I want to talk a little bit about the message out there. We saw that graph earlier, and that sudden 27% drop in 2009 that was credited with training programs and safety campaigns. I did some research on our own YouTube stories that we've done on motorcycle safety, and they seem to be falling on deaf ears. They're below average for the number of views we get for a YouTube video. No comments, no likes, no dislikes. You mentioned also a plateau on seatbelt use. Mm-hmm. Do you run this risk of hitting a plateau at some point in safety campaigns, and how do you break through that to lower the bad numbers, raise the good ones?
Well, there's a lot of factors when it comes to motorcycle safety that we're dealing with. I just talked about one, is the fact that the motorcycles are changing. But cars are also getting bigger. There's more distractions to automobile riders. So the environment that the motorcycles are operating in is getting increasingly hazardous. So it's getting tougher for motorcycle riders. More people are riding motorcycles when the gas prices go up, and then they're going to be less experienced. As the Motor Vehicle Task Force for the Department of Defense, they sponsored some studies, and when it came to the training, getting that good basic training initially for the folks is great, but then reinforcing that training within the first year we have found to be very effective, and that's what we put into policy in the 6055.4 series. So all the services now are looking at trying to do those first two, the basic and the intermediate training within that first year when people are riding motorcycles, and we have found that's probably the most effective intervention that we've been able to employ.
Now, Colonel, I'm going to go back to the messaging. And when we look at the graph, the 20 to 24 year age is I mean, the most fatalities, accidents occur at that age group. How do we get a message to that age group that isn't so preachy? I mean, how do you speak to this age group and convince them that, you know, driving, you know, under safe conditions or whatever is a problem?
That's actually a great question, because that age group and motorcycle riders in particular, for the most part, when an authority tells them to do something, they'll go talk to the hand. All right, so the most effective way we can message it is peer-to-peer. So we get young motorcycle riders to talk to young motorcycle riders, people that have had experience, people that have been there, done that, or people that they look up to. The Air Force has a airman-to-airman program that they talk about, where they've had some peers that have had experiences where they go out on the road and talk one-to-one, you know, eye-to-eye with these people, not just these broadcast messages, but customized messages, talking, interfacing with them, telling them, here's what it is that you need to do, because that's how you're going to get that message to that target audience that you're talking about.
Program that the Marine Corps produced called Semper Ride that we run here on TPC, and it's motocross, motorcycle riders, beautiful visuals out in the desert, and again, that peer-to-peer talk that you were mentioning.
Yes, and you know, certainly other ways, social media, not so much web-based anymore, but you know, even trying to go to the smartphone, social media, text messaging types of medium to be able to talk on the appropriate level to that crowd.
Right. Now, something we're looking at here on the screen, I thought it was interesting a few minutes ago, you brought up the fact that cars are bigger. Cars are bigger, and how many of these, the so-called crotch rockets out there on the road, you have that versus the Escalade. And what does that do to your figures?
I had a policeman friend who used to always refer to motorcycles and cars, and in the interaction he called it his lug nut theory. It goes, whenever those two of those collide, oh ye with the most lug nuts wins, and it's never the motorcycle. So I mean, it's simple physics. You got higher speed motorcycles, bigger cars, so the impact, and no pun intended, when the two of them collide is going to get worse and worse. So I said the environment that we're operating in is increasing in a threat. So even though, you know, we increase what we're doing, we're trying to impact those numbers, but it's an uphill battle.
How much does proper gear factor into safety? It has to have a pretty good size impact that
you're wearing.
Yeah, the PPE for riders is one of the most effective things you can do. I mean, wear the helmet, get the proper reflective gear, wear the right gloves, right, you know, eye coverage, those types of things. You know, simply riding on a bike at high speed and having a bird, a bug, or something like that go in your eye comes a big distraction. You can lose control. And then certainly in the case of an impact with an obstacle, a vehicle, something stationary on the side of the road or something like that, it's probably your best line of defense, because there's not much else between you and what's out there. So wear good gear and protect yourself.
Yeah, it's a contest. It's no accident, no pun intended, that when the emergency medical technicians, when they speak back and forth to the hospital on the radio, they talk about what the crash was. They say an MVA, a motor vehicle accident, and they'll say truck versus pedestrian. When you put it in those terms of versus, as if it's a game, I think you know who's going to win.
Yeah, well, it certainly frames the problem that you're dealing with in that case.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks. Coming up after the break, what to know when you go off-road. Military personnel sometimes use all-terrain vehicles, or ATVs, in their jobs, and some military vehicles are a lot like ATVs. But even if you're using them just for fun, there are still rules and things that you should do to avoid an injury. To continue our discussion on playing it safe is Colonel Doug Slocum. He's the safety chief for the Air National Guard. I always get the impression that people think that ATVs are safe because they have four wheels, but I'm not certain if that's correct or if it's just the conditions under which they drive them.
Well, anytime you're in a four-wheel vehicle and you're exposed to the outside, I mean, there's going to be a threat or a hazard just inherent to that type of vehicle. You know, we used to have the three-wheel ATVs, and they had the stability problems, and we learned very quickly that those were a bad idea. And I don't believe those are manufactured here in the United States anymore. Now we've gone to the four-wheel design, which is much more stable. But certainly, just like motorcycles, just like motor vehicles, there are things that we need to do, both in terms of equipment, in terms of behavior, to operate ATVs safely.
I know that about 15, 20 years ago when I was working in the Midwest, we'd lead a newscast almost every weekend, it seemed like, with a kid being, and by kid I mean someone under 12 years of age, who was either hurt or killed in an ATV accident. Obviously the machines have gotten a lot safer, but what kind of safety advice should be passed along to the children out there of military members?
Well, anytime you're operating ATVs, you want to do the same thing. First of all, there's training available to learn how to operate them properly. You want to make sure that the vehicles are in good condition. If you're going to go out and operate them, having tires that aren't inflated properly, these types of things. Then, of course, wearing your PPE, make sure you've got a helmet on, the proper stuff to wear, and you're doing it in a smart manner. There are places to ride ATVs, and there's places you shouldn't ride ATVs. And then lastly, of course, comes the risky behavior. You set up the ramp and see how far you can jump. That's probably going to lead to something bad if you keep doing that. And people say, how far can I push it? And you have to realize that you can have a lot of fun operating these things right in the heart of the envelope where they were designed to operate safely.
Now, Colonel, people who enjoy riding ATVs often do so in rural areas where it's mountainous, sometimes in the desert, or in sometimes adverse weather conditions.
Mud.
Does the military, was it MWR, do they offer any classes to teach service members how to operate ATVs in sometimes these challenging environments?
Well, certainly the services safety divisions offer ATV type of training for folks. I'm not sure through the MWR channels themselves, but for dependents or military members operating MWR vehicles, it's mandated through our rules that they have the training and wear the PPE. So that's one of the policies that we have in place. For people operating on their own when they go out with personally owned vehicles, not during duty hours and all, we encourage it and we offer that. We make sure that they are able to have that training and know what types of things that they can do to make the whole ride safer and to get them home. Specific behaviors, if you're going to go ride in rural areas, ride with somebody else. If somebody, you hear all the time, an accident happens and they have to wait for hours. Well, if you're riding with somebody else, you got your wingman, you got your battle buddy there who's there to look at and give you good advice. If you're doing something stupid, they might come up, bop you on the head and say, that's stupid, stop it. So it's good to have people there. It's good to be equipped to ride properly. And there's certainly ways to do it safe, and that's what we're trying to encourage people to do.
Talking about motorcycles, and when we've been talking about ATVs a couple of times, you've mentioned PPE, and I think we know what that is, but let's make sure the audience knows what that is. PPE is?
Personal protective equipment. This is your helmets, your eyewear, the clothing that you wear, the gloves, all these types of things that are our safety bags, our airbags, if you will. That last line of defense that if something happens, it's the barrier between us and the consequences of the mistake.
You have a personal experience. You were talking in one of the breaks about your own experience motocrossing and how your equipment may have helped you.
Yes, well, when I was a teenager, I used to ride motocross when I lived in Utah. And spent a lot of time doing that, and modeling the same behaviors that I say don't do. I was riding by myself at dusk, heading home one time, and to this day, I don't know, something crossed the trail. I hit the front brake on it, and up and over the bike I went. When I woke up, there was a dent in my helmet from a rock. So I'm pretty convinced to this day that wearing that helmet was a lifesaver in my particular case. So I'm a big believer in them.
Absolutely makes a difference. There's no question about it. Any of us who have ever been in any sort of an accident, any sort of a situation where our head met the concrete or met the asphalt and there wasn't a helmet in between, then I think it sort of gives you that knowledge inside to not get on a motorcycle and do exactly the same thing.
Well, in the military, we do our business all the time. I fly F-16 aircraft. I wouldn't think of getting in that airplane without wearing a helmet, without wearing the gloves, without having the proper flight suit on. It just is common sense. Well, we should use that same common sense when we're out there operating our ATVs, motorcycles, and personal vehicles. It's these common sense things. We do it at work. Let's use that same logic at home so that we can get everybody home safe every night.
Another thing you were talking about earlier when we were in a break, how there can be a chain of events that makes a perfectly safe situation become progressively more dangerous. You were talking about driving in a car, but with ATVs, you're often doing other things. You're running cattle, like I was telling you about my elderly aunt doing with an ATV, or you may be on a hunting trip. It seems like those kinds of things would add up pretty quickly with an ATV.
Well, and that's true for cars, ATVs, motorcycles. It's never just one thing. You could be speeding just a little bit. It might be raining. It might be, part equipment problems with the brakes or a headlight or something like this. There's only certain variables we have control over. But when a bad thing happens, you're right, it's these little things that line up that all of a sudden, when this adds to this, and we no longer have the safety margins available to us, that we end up in that square corner where a bad thing happens. So what I try and tell people is control what you can control. You know, ride the speed limit so that if it's rainy, it's dark, and you don't have the equipment operating properly, that you still have those safety margins available to you. So control what you can. It might seem like it doesn't matter, but when it comes to these bad situations, that can be the difference between life and death.
And of course, the one thing that has been talked about over and over and over, and we haven't spent time talking about it here, and we are running out of time, but it's so obvious, is alcohol. You don't want to mix alcohol with any of these vehicles.
That is a true statement. I mean, none for the road is the way I put it. You know, anybody drinking, if the first time you pop the top to that beer, hand the keys to your wife, to your spouse, somebody, you know, let somebody else drive. You know, there's no reason to push those margins at all, because you're right, it goes into that risky behavior. Alcohol has effect on the way we think, the way we react, and it has an effect on our motor skills.
Right.
So it affects the way that we drive. So you're right, we just want to avoid that.
It's the only way to go.
Correct.
Absolutely the only way to go. Colonel Doug Slocum, Chief of the Air National Guard Safety Division, and call sign Odie, an F-16 driver. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me here today.
That's Studio 5. We hope you'll join us again. Bye-bye.